involved and everyone affected to somehow find peace and strength through this very just horrible, horrible situation. Now I'll introduce our panelists. First, I want to introduce my friend and fellow Gold Institute Media Fellow, Adele Nazarian. Adele, hello. Rocky Ezrani, who is the Executive Director of the Chingar Project. Hello, Rocky. And Utsav Chakrabarti, who's the Executive Director of Hindu Pack. Good afternoon to all of you. Adele, why don't you kick this off with some opening thoughts about the panel and just to sort of give us some opening framing. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much, Neil. It's such a privilege and an honor to be part of the Gold Institute with you, who I've known for many years, and you're a brilliant man who has done such great work, and honored to be, again, on this journey with you. So thank you. And yeah, definitely taking some time, a moment to reflect on the atrocity that occurred in Texas, of course, yesterday or the past 24 hours. And it's something that actually is, I'd say, is even, plays into a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, how issues affecting the Indian American Indians rather, occurring at home in India, for many who are from India, for example, the entire subcontinent, affect Indian Americans living in America and the diaspora community. So as a daughter of Iranian immigrants myself, I have to say that I definitely have seen and witnessed firsthand how issues that occur in their original homeland, of course, they consider America home now, but Iran was their original homeland, definitely affect them here. And that is very similar to what I've noticed in my work with members of the Indian American diaspora and the Hindu diaspora community, and many different individuals who practice different faiths who are from that part of the world, where there is no doubt that culturally, there is a tie, and what happens back there definitely disproportionately impacts what happens at home in America as well. So a lot of it has to do with misinformation that's being spread in mainstream media, and it can easily be used to be weaponized against Indian Americans. And that's why there is such a need for counter information and more education and knowledge to also be spread to counter those pieces of misinformation, the propaganda, so to speak. If you look at it, for example, there's an example that I like to raise about post 9/11, where we had a lot of individuals who are practicing Sikhs, which is a faith in the Indian subcontinent. Also, there are many Sikhs living in America. I believe it's the second largest population of Sikhs who are living outside of India are in America. And they also wear turbans, and it is a religious symbol. It's part of their faith. And of course, we all are aware of the fact that Osama bin Laden used to wear a turban. And so post 9/11, a lot of Sikhs in America were actually being harassed and called Islamists and called terrorists because of the resemblance to Osama bin Laden. And so there we have one example of how issues affecting the diaspora community, even though they weren't actually, Saudi like bin Laden, but they were perceived as being that way because of their religious affixation, the symbol they wore in their heads. It's also an issue when you look at the fact that Indian American lawmakers, for example, they've come under a tremendous amount of pressure to, let's say, denounce the Indian government, which is currently led by Narendra Modi, the prime minister there, and their position on certain geopolitical issues. Right now, we're in the midst of a very expensive and deadly war that's going on between Ukraine and Russia. And of course, the Modi government has taken the stance of being a little more neutral when it comes to taking a position, not condemning Russia the way that many Indian American lawmakers, for example, have been doing so in America. And so what happens is you see a lot of Indian American lawmakers who are kind of seen as representing those who look similar to them. You have the issue of identity politics that also falls into that line. And that's not necessarily true. the issue is that they don't necessarily reflect the interests of the constituents they represent. And just because someone looks a certain way or resembles someone doesn't necessarily mean that they hold the same viewpoints as they do. And that is a big issue that needs to be, addressed. And we're going to hopefully be talking about that today. Of course, my two colleagues here who are also on the panel are going to be delving into different aspects of issues that affect the diaspora community based on what occurs on the Indian subcontinent. So that's my
well, of course, Adele, I know that you are, like myself, are a political animal, and so I'm not surprised the take you took on that. But Rocky, you're dealing in more socio-cultural issues. Let's before we get to the further discussion, what are your sort of opening thoughts as we start off this panel?
Yeah, so thank you, Neil. Thank you, Adele, for inviting me on here, allowing me to be a part of this panel. I think there are a couple of points that I just want to make, right? One is that, if you look at the US-India relationship over the last 5 decades, they have, especially if you look at like 1971, when President Nixon sent the American 7th Fleet into the Bay of Bengal to help Pakistan against India in December of that year. Things have changed dramatically in the last 5 decades, especially between this relationship between U.S. and India. There's a growing realization in Washington that India holds a very strong importance, not only for peace in the Indian subcontinent, but geopolitically, as the U.S. also seems to recognize this ever-growing threat that China poses to the United States and to the rest of the world. In fact, the Quad meeting that's happening in Japan is actually, that just ended, is further evidence of this growing realization of this threat. But what I find interesting, what I find really interesting is the idea that these two phenomena are really happening together, right? That this rising threat of China and this rising power of India. I find it surprising that really only most perceptive of government officials really seem to be putting the two together, this problem and this solution, that the way to challenge a rising China is to support the rising democratic power of India as a strategic ally that shares similar values and similar ethos. And over the past 20 years, I think this realization is happening rather slowly. And I just want to make one quick point, is that, if you look at the Senate Foreign Relations hearing that happened in March of 2022, that discussed UN foreign policy towards India, that hearing really demonstrated the dichotomy in Washington's thinking regarding foreign policy towards India. One hand you had congressional representatives like Senator Ted Cruz from Texas or Senator Todd Young from Indiana. Their comments and questions really seem to clearly understand 3 very important points. Isolated incidences of crime or bad actions of bad elements happen in every country. Just like the US, India has a strong working democratic system and a process. May not be perfect. The US is, neither process is perfect, but they have a process in place to handle internal problems effectively. And a strong US-India relationship that's built on mutual respect and cooperation is very important to counter this growing threat. And the second part of this that you saw in that same hearing is the idea that there were some congressmen that instead tend to harp on these isolated law and order incidences that happen within India to define India while completely oblivious to the real threats out there in the world and the damage that they're doing. And by doing so, they really largely ignore the positive influence that Indian Americans have really had on the American society as doctors, engineers, CEOs, entrepreneurs. My father used to say that people act according to their nature. And for this reason, I find it very interesting that the American ecosystem, or at least parts of the American ecosystem, they use a very shallow understanding of India to define the Indian American population here, as opposed to the other way around, right? Using the immense positive contributions of the Indian American community to understand the psyche of India as a nation, right? But, when we talk about, and this is where Chingari comes in, when we talk about issues from the Indian subcontinent, you really can't, the discussion just cannot be complete without talking about Pakistan. right? This is a country that shares a very common history, similar language, food, customs with India. After all, they were one country prior to partition in 1947. Pakistan is like India's troubled little brother that causes havoc for itself and then the world around them. And the differences between India and Pakistan are huge, right? In terms of GDP, in terms of population, in terms of landmass. And actually, in the last 2 decades, especially under Prime Minister Modi, the differences have become even larger between the two. I mean, India is moving up in the world. Pakistan just isn't, and they share a common ancestry. In fact, both my parents are from a Sindh province in Pakistan. It was undivided India at the time. Both my parents came from families that were very well settled. They had good lives in that region. And then all of a sudden in 1947, partition happened. And this one country was being divided into two. And, initially, I think that the elders in the family were thinking just to stay, right? They had good lives. Why should they uproot themselves? And all of a sudden, this violence against Hindus and Christians and Sikhs blew up. And they were really forced to leave and forced to leave rather quickly. They had to leave everything behind. And they did it to save their lives as well as the lives and dignity of their children, right? And then when they arrived in India, they were basically refugees in their own country. They're not sure where to go or what to do. Tens of millions of people had to flee Pakistan, that region, to move to India to save their lives. And my parents' families were extremely lucky to leave Pakistan when they did, but there were lots of families that weren't so lucky. They stayed because they weren't willing to leave everything, or they trusted the system there. And then after a while of staying, it just became hard to leave. And eventually they actually, all of them, if you look at the history and what's happened in that region, they've lost everything. In 1947, the percentage of religious minorities in Pakistan was close to 27%. Today, it's less than 3%. I mean, how does that happen? And it's basically because in the past 75 years, religious minorities, Hindus, Christians, and Sikhs have been massacred, forcibly converted, or they fled into India, right? They were forced to flee into India or neighboring countries. There's a huge humanitarian problem happening on the Indian subcontinent, and it's happening in Pakistan. According to the US State Department, over the past 25 years, Pakistan has been the loci of terrorism in the world. Terrorism that affects both the US, India, Israel, and the rest of the world. But it's the internal chaos in Pakistan that really weighs on the Indian American psyche more than most things, right? For example, there are daily reports of Pakistani citizens, of Hindu, Christian, Sikh communities that are being persecuted in the most vile ways. It's not just their livelihoods or properties that are being taken away. It's actually their most valuable possession, their children. Right? And according to the Pakistani NGOs on the ground in Pakistan, according to the UN Human Rights Commission, the Human Rights Commission of the European Parliament, the USCIRF, the State Department, it is estimated that 1,000 young Hindu, Christian, and Sikh girls are snatched from their parents each and every year. That is 3 girls a year, 3 girls a day on average. For the last 75 years, that's 75,000 girls that have been snatched from their parents, raped, forcibly converted to Islam, and then married off to men that are older than their fathers. Men who already have other wives and other children. And then like in India and in the US, the legal system, the police department, the government agencies, they either implicitly and sometimes even explicitly support these horrible atrocities. The system in Pakistan is completely undemocratic and completely broken. I mean, the daily injustices that religious minorities face in Pakistan are systemic. And unfortunately, this is a US ally. This is a US ally to whom we have given billions of US taxpayer dollars without any accountability. And that's what Chingari has done. Chingari in the last couple of years have been meeting with lawmakers, not only here in the US, but around the world, to educate them on the damage that we're doing in, by giving all this money to Pakistan without any accountability. We basically have been demanding accountability for the US money that's going there. These level atrocities being committed against Pakistani citizens, especially young children, solely because of their religion, is paramount concern, not only for the Indian Americans, but for everyone on the Indian subcontinent, and hopefully to the world. So, thank you.
Well, no, I think it speaks to the warmth and generosity of your heart, Rocky, that you referred to Pakistan's role in the world as havoc. I think that was That was a euphemism if I ever heard one. It's certainly, they're responsible for so much death and destruction. And it's outside the scope of this panel, but certainly, people talk about 20 years of war in Afghanistan. It would have been 3 years of war and peace in Afghanistan if it wasn't for our Pakistani ally and everything. If they had chosen to support our project there, the world would have been different for so many millions of people. But thank you for that. And Buksov, last but not least, batting cleanup. Good afternoon, and your opening remarks for today's panel.
Thank you, Neil. And I want to continue further from what Adele and Raki pointed out in terms of Indian American communities and how things from the subcontinent affect them. So there are close to 5 million Indian Americans. It is one of the fastest growing immigrant communities in America, and it has one of the highest per capita income. But that's the bright side of the story. Over the past decade, it has also become the victim of targeted influence efforts, slander, hate, and violence from other interest groups, some of which are geostrategic in nature. These groups see themselves as stakeholders in a geopolitical conflict against India. Their actions in America stem from their desire to treat Indian Americans as an extension of their target, which is India. This is giving birth to a conflict industry on our soil here that is spawning hate and disinformation against not just Indian Americans, but also American Hindu communities, many of whom are non-Indian ethnically. So here are some examples of a set of events that happened over the last couple of years. And I'll go further into why and how they're happening. Number one, a statue of Mahatma Gandhi is vandalized in California, and he's labeled as a child rapist, a racist, and a casteist. The campaign is spearheaded by a certain organization. A few months later, a 3-day conference happens where it's titled Dismantle Hinduness or Dismantle Hindutva. Again, randomly happens under a protection of a certain organization. There is United States Commission for International Religious Freedom, which suddenly blacklists India, calling it a fascist government. The government there, a fascist government. In the American context, a campaign is suddenly launched, again, in another state, where identity of Indian CEOs in different companies are described on the basis of their caste. There are farmer protests in India, and suddenly a group of organizations start sending money from here and get live primetime coverage on CNN and Washington Post and New York Times. Again, same group of people somehow are connected to each other. The events that are happening are not connected, but the group is the same. And it's the same bunch of people doing different things in different parts of the country. Their main goal is to identify the fault lines that are existent in a diverse country like India and use it to target Indian American populations and Hindu Americans by extension. So this is the process that is happening here. You dent India's soft power in the American context because that undermines the Indian American success story. Step number 2, build a narrative that anything that is related to India and Hindu-ness is equivalent to fascism, because that's the watchword that everybody nowadays wants to use to undermine their opposition. Add to that a layer of Islamophobia, because that's another watchword that goes in the mainstream. Create a villain, and then procure the narrative at a global level that a genocide is about to happen. And then you can launch any campaign against any community in the American mainstream, and they are vilified. So it is important to understand who are the key players that are indulging in this narrative building and how they are working together. And this is the most interesting part. The key players here are the Pakistan, Turkey, Qatar, Muslim Brotherhood axis. Joining hands, here is the interesting part, with the Soros-Omidyar axis. Now, I don't know, a lot of our audience may not know the identities of these individuals and groups that I mentioned, But this is a very interesting intersectionality, because what is happening is that the Soros-Omidyar axis, which is by their definition and identity, a more secularized axis, it is giving legitimacy to a far more sinister and Islamist axis, which is the Pakistan, Turkey, Qatar, Muslim Brotherhood axis. And in doing so, it is actually making this entire anti-India disinformation campaign a much more diverse campaign than it actually is. So what is the outcome of this effort? You are seeing an entire generation of Indian Americans in schools, in campuses, in the public square, in companies, in professional setups, growing up to see a targeted disinformation against them that is not only appearing in Islamic Horizons, which is a Muslim Brotherhood linked media outlet, printed media outlet that actually shows up in every public library in America. So you see a propaganda narrative showing up in Islamic Horizons and the same propaganda narrative being repeated in New York Times. And that's a very dangerous and potent campaign to counter. So given the amount of disinformation that is happening right now and the scale with which it is being put out, I can foresee that the Indian American, especially over the next 10 years, has a hard time coming for them. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, guys. And so in our first round of questioning, I'm going to ask a question to all three of you. I do want to remind all the participants that they can ask questions in the chat box, and which assumes I'll be able to find the chat box, but that's maybe Adele can. Adele, do you know where the chat box is?
Happy to, absolutely. It's on the bottom part of the screen. We have a little icon that says chat on it. And I think that we have one question so far.
Well, let's, you want to, so keep them coming, and then we'll do, we'll have a robust Q&A. But I want to give the panelists all some time on this. The first question, and we sort of, everybody sort of touched upon this in their opening remarks, but how exactly does what's going on in India affect what's going on for Indian Americans here? Like, what are the concrete things that happen? And Adele, why don't you start us off?
Thank you. So, well, I think it comes back to the whole notion of identity politics, honestly. It's the idea that when you have someone, let's say, that does something in a certain country, then automatically it's assumed that everyone else that looks similar to them is also going to hold that same line of thought, the same purview. And there's a lot of pressure, I think, at home to kind of adhere to, and I'll add this too, if I may, it goes back to the Indian American politicians, right? You have certain ones in the current administration who are obviously towing the line of the current administration. And we know that US-India relations have had their ebbs and flows. And of course, I've been speaking about the importance of strengthening the US-India relationship for many years now, as obviously everyone here agrees. And what we see is a lot of the individuals that are Indian American in this with the current administration are towing a lot of the same talking points, towing the line of what they're saying. And so when you have let's say the Modi government that is a little bit more neutral when it comes to the stance towards the whole Ukraine incident, then you have lawmakers here in America that are Indian American, like the Ro Khannas, let's say, and whatnot, and who's a California congressman, we're all familiar with him, who are being critical of the Modi government and calling them, a right-wing, extremist kind of government. Then we are faced with all the Indian Americans here in the United States being either they don't agree with what is being said by that lawmaker, being called, oh, you're a Modi extremist or you're a right-wing extremist. That's not the case, right? That's not true at all. And so, or you have the opposite of that, where if they're, if you're someone who has a more neutral stance and you're not exactly, agreeing with what the lawmaker says, then you're kind of seen as, or you're taking more nutrients, you're seen as being more of a left-wing propagandist. So one way or the other, it's always going to be an extreme. And I will also relate this to the fact that India has a very, very diverse population when it comes to religious minorities. And what happens too is, unfortunately, there are with the actions in Pakistan, for example. Let's bring up Pakistan. It's been brought up very, very frequently, and it's a very important, relevant country to talk about. Sorry for the noise in the hallway. So essentially, when someone carries out an act of terror, right, in the name of whatever faith or religion they have, right? So it's going to, unfortunately, also disproportionately impact the population that is in America that is of that same faith. And we have that occurring with radical Islamists who are carrying out terror on the Indian subcontinent itself also, and individuals who are targeted as terrorists and said you're a terrorist because you look like that person, you look like that individual. So there is no doubt that there's a correlation between what happens in a person's country of origin and the diaspora community.
I think that maybe one of the most powerful political slogans, like in world history, is, this time it's a Modi government. And, I don't think people at the time fully appreciated how different Modi would be. And it's the temptation is always to say that he's India's Trump. And that's, that only goes so far, but certainly he has sort of broken down barriers, and he tries new things. And, rightly or wrongly, I think that what goes on in India is going to have an effect on Indian Americans who obviously have families and businesses back home, but also, there are pressures on them here. Rocky, how do you think that what goes on in India is affecting you and other Indian Americans?
So, I think the perfect example of how things in India really affected us here is as I mentioned, that religious minorities in Pakistan are persecuted daily. The atrocities are just hard to read about, they're hard to watch. Even for my parents who are from that area, a lot of times they're like, I can't watch it. Right? So many years ago, a few years ago, the Prime Minister Modi's government passed a bill that was called the Citizenship Amendment Act. It's very similar to the Lautenberg Amendment that happened in the US Congress to protect religious minorities that were persecuted in the Soviet Union or Iran and other countries. So India did that. And all of a sudden you had city councils across the United States. There were, I think, 7 city councils across the United States that decided to pass resolutions calling India Islamophobic. So here is a bill that was completely a humanitarian gesture to protect the people that made the bad decision of staying in Pakistan in that 1947 to 1955 thing. And when they finally decided to leave and come into India, the attempts by the Indian government to help them integrate them into the population was termed Islamophobic. Okay? And I think that is that is something that really hurts the Indian American psyche, because we understand the history. We understand what has happened. We understand what happened during partition, which was the largest displacement in the world's history, right? So many people, tens of millions of people were affected. And here's something that the Indian government was trying to correct a wrong that was done and help these people that are living in slums and suffering in various parts of India. And it was termed Islamophobic here. And I think it's things like that the media does, or these people that are very ignorant on the history and the demographics and what actually is a reality. And they make these decisions, or they take these actions that are hurtful to a very, positive contributing segment of the US population. So
Right. And of course, this partition, right, which to world leaders was basically, a bunch of guys took a pen and they draw a line on a piece of paper and they say, okay, figure it out. When actually it creates everyone calls it the subcontinent. India, by any other definition, India is its own continent. That's any other definition of a continent. India is a continent, but you have continent-wide ethnic cleansing with all of the horrific implications of that. And every single time there is any kind of Hindu on Islamic violence or protests, or where they build a temple, they tear down a mosque and they build a temple, that's front page news, and we hear all about it. And if you weren't looking for it, you would have no idea that it went the other way. Is that consistent, Rocky, with how you see it?
Oh, it's exactly, and it's that hypocrisy that, you know, they'll take isolated instances or one little thing that happens in India and blow it up that, you know, like Utsav said, right, that Indian Americans or India is, you know, fascist and, you know, discriminatory. But then these things happen daily in countries like Afghanistan or Pakistan or wherever, and they're ignored.
Yeah,
Right?
microcosm is not always allegory. And though you wouldn't know it by reading the press. Utsav, your input, sir, on you know, what goes on back in India affecting here in the U.S.
Absolutely. And I completely agree with the way Raki talked about the CA, the Citizen Amendment Act. Another example of the similar kind of disinformation was when recently in the last couple of years, the Narendra Modi government integrated the state of Jammu and Kashmir fully into India, providing legal and equal status to members of minority communities in Kashmir, and members of LGBTQ community there, and members of and women primarily, because until that point of time, there were quasi-Islamic laws that were preventing equal status, even though the state of Jammu and Kashmir was under the Indian administration for a long time, for 70 years. When the Modi government did that, there was such a vicious campaign launched against Indian Americans, and resolutions were brought in the House using Indian American lawmakers who would literally portray this as if you know, there was a Nazi state that has just taken over Poland or Czechoslovakia in 1945, and that was as far away from truth as you can be. And this is the kind of vilification that then later on expanded itself in American campuses. I had so many under Hindu Pact. I hear a lot of young students came to me around that time and said, "Look, what do I believe in? Because, you know, there is a student group in my campus who is calling me fascist just because I'm Indian." And the person has absolutely no connection to India in any way, because they are mostly born in America. And not just that, they were fed information that is completely opposite to what was actually happening on the ground. So it was a very dangerous situation that is emerging. It continues to emerge. And what I worry most is that because there is a lack of counter narrative, because it's the, you know, the identification of the groups that I made, because it's the Muslim Brotherhood / liberal left joining hands to peddle this kind of disinformation, it is extremely hard to provide a counter narrative, which is the most dangerous part of this situation.
Yeah, I'll just make a quick observation as, you know, when you're talking about these kids, you know, students, the children, obviously they're aware of their culture, but they're not always tracking the latest legislation back in India, and then to be targeted and to be called a fascist. Certainly, I will say that every real fascist knows that they are indeed a fascist. Like they have a self-awareness that is part of that ideology, and to ascribe it to people who are just really spectators, right? You know, just happen to be interested spectators, and to be just sort of lumped in with people like that, it's absolutely horrible. I do want to ask, you know, because I want to have some time for questions. I just want to sort of jump to this. You know, this is a nation that has, you know, hundreds of diaspora. Like, you know, I'm Boston Irish, and so I'm very much aware of, you know, members of my family that came from Ireland. But then you have Boston Irish is actually described as an ethnicity. You might have like a guy running for Congress in California, and he's described coming from a Boston Irish family. So now there's like a diaspora from the diaspora. But I think that the Indian Americans have unique conflicts with the Chinese and the Islamist diasporas, and we've talked about the Islamists. So, but I think like in areas like Silicon Valley and other places where there's a high percentage of Chinese, that there's violence and there's conflict and there's discrimination. Maybe Utsav, maybe why don't you could kick this off?
Sure. So, you know, the Indian American community in the Silicon Valley area, as well as the Chinese American community, kind of operate in the same technological space, in the same social spaces. And what has been interesting in that there is a rivalry between these two diaspora communities that is an extension of the geopolitical rivalry that happens in the Asian region and the Indo-Pacific. So you can see that in the way corporate rivalries have emerged. It's not discussed much in the American mainstream, and this is one of the lesser discussed rivalries that is, but it does affect both the communities. And within the Chinese community, there is a division between the Taiwanese American community and the Chinese community, which is a whole conversation in itself. But there is corporate rivalry. What is interesting is that over the last couple of decades, there have been so many cases of Chinese diaspora being involved in industrial espionage and copyright violation and transferring of intellectual property from America to China illegally. Whereas that level of it is rarely reported from the Indian American community, which also points to their outlook towards the land that they work in and the land that has that they are now part of. So this is an interesting contrast, but this is also a very growing rivalry that you pointed out, Neil.
Well, and I think it's okay to talk about cultural differences. No one goes to jail for saying there's a difference between an Italian and a German. It's like it just so happens that cultures are different. But I think that one of the things is like with sort of the more Muslim culture and in the Chinese, there is less emphasis on the individual, and I think that there's something in the Indian culture, and I think frankly the Anglo-Saxon overlay that culture that has made Indian Americans sort of immune to that sort of behavior, more independent and more resistant to orders from overseas. Certainly there's so many Chinese Americans, who are good and hardworking and patriotic Americans, but there are so many who are taking orders directly from their government, and it just seems that there's a cultural bias towards that. But Rocky, did you want to weigh in on this?
I guess the only thing I'll say is that I think that maybe it's because India was ruled by Mughal leaders for 800 years, and then the British were in there for another 200 or so years. That the mentality in I think the Indian American communities, we're very focused on just putting your head, just contributing to the society and doing what's right and just moving ahead. And we're not, we don't have a victim mentality that kind of pushes us forward. We're very focused on just what is our job, let's just get it done kind of thing. And I think that's a huge difference between maybe the Indian American community and how we approach things and some of the other communities possibly.
Yeah. Adele, I think we have some time to start our robust Q&A. Why don't you start? Why don't you read some of these questions?
So I think it's a good, we just touched upon the blasphemy laws, right? And so I just want to point out, if I may, though.
Yeah, please.
The majority of, so blasphemy laws were astonishingly, banished, I think in 2008 in Scotland and in 2021 in the UK or so. But there's only a few countries that actually do carry out the death penalty for blasphemy, which is a non-violent crime. Those are Afghanistan, Brunei, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Mauritania, Nigeria, and some parts of the northern parts of Nigeria, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the Al-Shabaab controlled areas of Somalia. There is an underlying theme with these countries, and it is that they are following Sharia law. So just wanted to kind of point that out there, that it's interesting to note that, that violent sort of death for criticizing one's God only occurs when following Sharia law. And the majority of, if I say Muslims in the world, I think are more, well, a lot of them are secular, at least in Iran. So just,
I grew up in a former British colony, Massachusetts, which of course was founded by witch burners. And fortunately we've moved on from there. But I think that today's left isn't as tolerant as of blasphemy of their point of view as they used to be. They used to be all for tolerance, but you can access that chat box. Why don't you could you help me out there, Adele?
So we kind of answered, I think, the blasphemy law. There is a question here regarding from John Rappaport. What are the top barriers to a more robust US-India strategic partnership, especially as it relates to Russia, China, and Pakistan?
I want to give a take on that.
Go ahead, Osai.
So there is 70 years of history between India and America that is one of the biggest barriers to begin with, because as the relationship between the two countries, the people-to-people relationship was always very good. Both are democratic society, extremely diverse societies, but geopolitically, India during the Cold War was more inclined towards the Soviet Union. So over the last 70 years, the geostrategic infrastructure of India had been aligned with that of the Soviet Union and later on with Russia. And that investment takes time to divest from. So that is, I think, one of the first hurdles that is there between India and America's strategic partnership. The second issue, I believe, is that both India and America did not see eye to eye at the bureaucracy level. And for so many decades. And the things with those of you who have been in bureaucracy will remember that bureaucracies have longer memories than people do. And especially military industrial bureaucracies. So bureaucracies in the countries don't trust each other, because of which any sort of strategic partnership that involves higher quality military alliances, which would be critical to India's relationship with America vis-a-vis Russia and China especially, that kind of military alliance is not developing as it was expected over the last 10 years. There are, I would believe there are a lot of hindrances in transfer of technology, especially fourth and fifth generation technologies that our platforms in America are very, very conversant with. Similarly, from the Indian side, there is a hesitation and distrust in terms of how America has over the last decades continued to supply Pakistan with military technology. And India is afraid in most cases that that overlap of shared technological information might put India at a tactical disadvantage in case there is a flare-up of conflict with Pakistan. India won't want equipments that India operates that then Pakistan can access using its influence in the military industrial complex here. So those are some of the real strategic issues that at the military level. Now, at the economic level, I believe that things are going much better. There is a much better shared economic partnership between India and America as compared to China, and obviously Russia is economically not in the same space. I would say it's a much smaller economy, especially with China. But the problem again here is that China has literally taken over American economy in terms of exports and in terms of owning America's wealth. And that is something that probably it's a conversation for another show, but that we in America have to figure out how we can actually dissuade ourselves and wean ourselves away from Chinese consumer products. And that's another issue of the partnership. But in terms of Pakistan, I think India and America are at a much better place today than they were 15 years ago. I think there is convergence in interest, especially with regards to China. But again, India has been left wanting. India feels very sad at the way the current administration withdrew from Afghanistan, actually to America's disadvantage. After losing more than 2,500 young men and women in Afghanistan, the way we left that space created so much problem for India. I don't know if you follow the fact that American weapons are now showing up in Kashmir within a couple of months of America leaving. So these are some of the things that makes India very, very reticent in approaching a stronger geopolitical partnership with America.
Yeah, it's interesting that those weapons are showing up in Kashmir because, of course, so many of the American weapons that we gave Russia ended up in Chairman Mao's army, leading to that rebooted revolution. I see here we have a question. how can talking about how Utsav was talking about the disinformation campaign involving terrorism and our, I guess our allies and not allies. How can the Gold Institute leadership bring this up to lawmakers? I will say that Gold Institute fellows are constantly meeting with lawmakers, especially our president and founder, Ellie Gold. And so that is not, we are getting our message across, and we meet with them regularly. Our headquarters is right on Capitol Hill. And so that's always an ongoing project. Let me see if I can figure out the scroll here. Historically, the US government has supported Pakistan against India for all of these years, while Russia has supported India. And that's an interesting dynamic. I don't know, Rocky, I don't know if you want to sort of weigh in on this. You know, we've talked about this before, you know, because you have China, you have Russia, you have India, you have Pakistan. The United States is almost sort of like bumping into all of these pre-existing interlocking relationships.
Yeah, I mean, it's like what Sib said, that, you know, bureaucracies have a long-term memory. And so I think a lot of that's changing in the last 2 decades. We really have seen a huge shift, you know, away from those traditional partnerships that were there, especially during the Cold War and all. And you know, I think even now during the Russia-Ukraine thing, it's becoming quite obvious. It's becoming harder for the US administrations and Washington to really ignore the growing threats in the world. And, you know, I think that the Quad and this new entity that Biden administration has just set up is really kind of indicative of the idea that these the power alliances actually have to shift in order to safeguard everyone in the world. So.
Well, I think we want to wrap it up, you know, so we can get people on with their lives. But before we do, let's just go around the horn and sort of talk about, you know, what is it that, you know, as an Indian American trying to resolve this this go-between, you know, it's like having a foot in both worlds. Sort of what is the path forward? Adele, you want to start?
Thank you. I think the main, first of all, I want to also address that there's something that how it works in DC. It's a ugly and beautiful reality depending on what side you're on at the moment, but it's lobbying. And frankly, that's the reason why, just to also answer that question too, why there is the US government has appeared to be a little more supportive of certain governments, certain countries at certain times and others at other times. It's unfortunately sometimes a cash game and a money game. And so I think that one of the main ways to be able to get ahead and to grow the US-India relationship, which is obviously very important geopolitically and strategically long-term, is through education. Education, the work the Gold Institute obviously is doing, the work that Hindu Pact is doing, the work that Chingari is doing, all organizations that are trying to help in their own ways, spread information, educate, and spread knowledge about the realities that are occurring on the ground, and to help break down any misconceptions that occur, stereotypes, and presenting a more human face to what's really, really occurring, as opposed to what the media often would like to put out there as their sound bites that acquire, coming from the media background as well in world, what is better for clickbait. And so that's part of it. And I urge everyone to continue, obviously, reaching out to lawmakers within your different districts, and to reach out to Rocky, to Utsav, if you have any, want any help in terms of how to do that as well, because both the organizations are involved with are very, very active, as well as obviously we are at the Gold Institute as well, in help making that a reality and to get you in touch with the people you need to talk to.
Adele, where can people find you on the social media and the interwebs?
Thank you. So I can be found on everywhere at Adele Naz. So it's, I'm putting it there actually. It's ADELLENAZ. That's my handle for Twitter and Instagram, and I think for Facebook.
Fantastic. Rocky, the road forward, as for people having foots in both worlds.
I think, I tell my kids this all the time, that we're living in a TikTok generation where things have to be, people don't want to look at the facts. They don't want to do a lot of research. They just want to make quick judgments. And, the media is really good at telling you how to think if you don't want to. And I think that's probably the biggest thing, is that the facts don't support a lot of what the media is saying and what's being put out there. The propaganda, as Adele said so nicely, that a lot of this is just propaganda, that's based on people that have the money to push out these narratives. I think that every responsible citizen in every country really needs to look at things that are being told from a more holistic point, looking at the history behind it, looking at what has happened, and make their own judgments, right? For CAA was a perfect example. The Article 370 abrogation that let's have mentioned was a perfect example. There were reasons why these things happened. And the second thing is that, people generally act according to their nature, right? You look at who the Indian American community are, what they've done and how they've contributed. And that gives you kind of an indication as to what Ellis came from, an Indian American, that background, right? And so understanding these two things, I think, would be very important to promote peace and harmony for everyone, basically.
Rocky, where can people find you on social media and also the Chingar Project?
I will put those in the chat.
Okay, very good. Sir, you're next. Are you ready?
Yes, thank you. Firstly, I want to thank Gold Institute for doing an amazing job. If people go and visit your website and go through past events, it's a whole a buffet of thoughtful presentation along with really unique geopolitical takes. It's one way to learn from to separate the real information from the disinformation. So thank you, Gold Institute, for making this effort. And secondly, I would like to say that what Adele and Raki pointed out, we need to go another step forward, and that is one of the things Hindu Pact is doing. We try to expose the people peddling the disinformation, because one way we don't have the resources to be the Soroses and the Muslim Brotherhoods of the world, but we have the resources and the knowledge and the information to expose to the world who the Soroses and the Muslim Brotherhood are, and that is a huge step forward in layering off the sinister interests that act on behalf of the people who peddle the disinformation. So one of the things we are doing is to expose those who are providing the disinformation and let people judge for themselves where their interests lie. At the end of the day, if a person's civilizational objective is to conquer the world and eradicate everybody else, you can only convince them so much that they are on the wrong side. So our job is to provide the layers, take the layers off, provide the information, and then we go from there.
Well, to sort of tie a bow on this, I just want to thank the panelists for being a part of this, and thank the Gold Institute fellows and colleagues who joined us, and obviously the Zoom audience. I would encourage everyone who's on this call to follow up with each of our panelists. Their contact information will be in the chat box. Just because of the nature of the panel, we can only sort of deal with the white caps, and we can just sort of touch upon which are subjects that are very deep and emotional. And I would also encourage everyone to check out the Gold Institute at goldiis.com for information about the Institute and how you can become more involved in the Gold Institute in the work that we're doing here in DC and around the world. This is Neil W. McCabe, and we're signing off now. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Take
you,
care,
Neil.
guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.